Marcus Washington stood on his front porch watching his 8-year-old daughter Maya chase fireflies in their backyard as the summer evening settled over their quiet suburban neighborhood. The sound of her laughter mixed with the gentle hum of cicadas, creating a peaceful symphony that reminded him why he'd fought so hard to build this life. After 3 tours with Delta Force in Afghanistan, Marcus had earned every moment of this tranquility. The house wasn't much to look at from the outside. A modest, 2-story colonial with white siding and blue shutters that his wife Sarah had insisted on painting herself, but it was theirs, purchased with his military savings and a VA loan after he'd completed his service. The small front yard was meticulously maintained, with flower beds that Sarah tended every weekend and the American flag that Marcus raised each morning without fail. Their neighborhood, Maple Grove Estates, was the kind of place where children rode bicycles on sidewalks and neighbors waved to each other while walking their dogs. Marcus had chosen it specifically for its reputation as a safe, family-friendly community. The Homeowners Association was supposed to keep property values stable and maintain certain standards, which had seemed like a good thing when they'd first moved in 2 years ago. Sarah emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel as she joined Marcus on the porch. Her dark skin glowed in the warm light spilling from their living room windows, and she smiled as she watched Maya's enthusiastic pursuit of the glowing insects. "Dinner's ready," she said softly, not wanting to interrupt their daughter's magical moment, "though I suspect someone's going to want to stay outside all night." Marcus wrapped his arm around his wife's shoulders, feeling the familiar comfort of her presence. These quiet family moments were treasures he'd learned not to take for granted during his years in combat zones. He'd seen too many families torn apart by deployment and lost to ever assume his own happiness was guaranteed. Every peaceful evening felt like a gift. The couple had met at a military ball in North Carolina, where Sarah worked as a nurse at the base hospital. She'd been the one to patch him up after a training accident, and her gentle competence had impressed him even more than her beauty. Their courtship had survived multiple deployments, and Sarah had supported his decision to leave the military when Maya was born. She wanted their daughter to have a father who came home every night, not one who disappeared for months at a time to places she couldn't pronounce. Marcus had transitioned from military service to working as a security consultant for a private firm, using his specialized training to help corporations protect their executives and assets. The work paid well and kept him close to home, though he sometimes missed the clear sense of mission that had defined his military years. In civilian life, the objectives weren't always as straightforward as they'd been when he was eliminating threats to national security. Maya's delighted squeal interrupted his thoughts as she successfully cupped a firefly in her small hands. "Daddy, look! I caught one!" She ran toward the porch, her curly hair bouncing with each step. Marcus crouched down as she approached, peering into her cupped palms where a tiny light blinked on and off like a natural strobe. "That's amazing, sweetheart," Marcus said, ruffling her hair. "What do you think you should do with it now?" He'd learned that these moments were opportunities to teach kindness and respect for living things, lessons that seemed especially important given the violence he'd witnessed overseas. Maya considered this seriously, her brow furrowed in concentration. "I should let it go so it can find its family," she decided, opening her hands. The firefly paused for a moment on her palm before taking flight, rejoining the dozen others that danced above their lawn. As they watched the firefly disappear into the gathering darkness, Marcus noticed a white pickup truck driving slowly down their street. The vehicle wasn't familiar, and something about its deliberate pace caught his attention. Years of tactical training had made him acutely aware of his surroundings, and vehicles that didn't belong in his neighborhood automatically registered as potential concerns. The truck paused in front of their house for several seconds before continuing down the street. Marcus made a mental note of its appearance. Newer model Ford, extended cab, no visible license plate from his angle. It could be nothing, just someone looking for an address or visiting a neighbor they'd never met. But in his experience, most innocent explanations didn't require that kind of obvious surveillance. Sarah noticed his sudden alertness and followed his gaze toward the street. "Everything okay?" she asked quietly, not wanting to alarm Maya, who was already chasing after another firefly. "Just a truck I didn't recognize," Marcus replied, keeping his tone casual. "Probably nothing, but I want to keep an eye." "Oh, This was another adjustment he'd had to make since leaving the military, learning to distinguish between genuine threats and the hypervigilance that had kept him alive in combat, but could make civilian life unnecessarily stressful. The family went inside for dinner, where Maya chattered excitedly about her firefly adventure, while picking at her chicken and vegetables. Marcus tried to focus on her animated storytelling, but part of his mind remained on that white truck. It was probably paranoia, a leftover from too many years of watching for roadside bombs and enemy surveillance. Still, he made a mental note to mention it to some of his neighbors, just to see if anyone else had noticed unusual activity. After dinner, they followed their usual routine: Maya's bath time, story reading, and the lengthy negotiation process that eventually resulted in her agreeing to go to sleep. By the time Marcus and Sarah had finished cleaning the kitchen and settled on their couch to watch the evening news, the incident with the truck had faded into background concern. Neither of them could have predicted that this peaceful evening would be their last truly quiet night for weeks to come. The men in that white truck weren't lost visitors or potential burglars conducting routine surveillance. They had specifically targeted the Washington family, and their plans would test every skill Marcus had learned during his years of specialized military training. As Marcus locked the front door before heading to bed, he took one last look out at their quiet street, noting the normal collection of parked cars and lit windows that indicated his neighbors were settling in for the night. Everything appeared perfectly normal, exactly as it should be in a safe suburban neighborhood where families could raise their children without fear. The doorbell rang at exactly 9:30 a.m. on a Saturday morning, interrupting Sarah's coffee and Marcus's review of his work emails. Maya was in the living room, sprawled on the carpet with her coloring book spread around her like a paper rainbow. The timing struck Marcus as odd. Most neighbors who dropped by unannounced usually waited until later in the day, after everyone had finished their morning routines. Marcus opened the door to find two white men in their 40s standing on his porch. Both wore polo shirts and khaki pants, and one carried a clipboard with official-looking papers attached. The taller man, who had graying hair and wore wire-rimmed glasses, stepped forward with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Mr. Washington, good morning. I'm Robert Henley, and this is my colleague Jeff Morrison. We're with the Maple Grove HOA Enforcement Division," the man said, holding up a laminated identification badge. "We need to discuss some violations that have been reported regarding your property." Marcus studied the men carefully, his military training automatically cataloging details. Henley spoke with the confidence of someone accustomed to authority, but there was something rehearsed about his presentation. Morrison remained silent, standing slightly behind his partner in a way that suggested he was there for backup rather than conversation. Neither man looked particularly comfortable despite their official demeanor. "I wasn't aware we had any violations," Marcus replied evenly, not inviting them inside but not closing the door either. "Could you be more specific about what's been reported?" Henley consulted his clipboard with theatrical seriousness. "We've received multiple complaints about unauthorized modifications to your front yard landscaping, improper storage of recreational equipment, and failure to maintain community standards for lawn care." He gestured toward Marcus's yard, which looked immaculate to any reasonable observer. Marcus followed his gesture, scanning his own property with fresh eyes. The grass was recently mowed, the flower beds were weed-free, and Sarah's carefully tended roses were blooming beautifully along the front of the house. Maya's bicycle was stored neatly in their garage, and the only recreational equipment visible was a small chalk drawing she'd created on their driveway the day before. "I'm having trouble seeing what you're referring to," Marcus said carefully. "Our landscaping hasn't been modified since we moved in, and everything appears to be in good condition." His tone remained polite but firm, the same voice he'd used to deal with difficult situations during his military career. Morrison spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a slight accent that Marcus couldn't immediately place. "The community has standards. Mr. Washington, some residents feel that certain properties aren't keeping up with the neighborhood's character." His emphasis on certain properties was subtle but unmistakable. Sarah appeared at Marcus's shoulder, drawn by the conversation. She wore her weekend clothes, jeans and one of Marcus's old army t-shirts, and carried Maya, who had gotten curious about the visitors. "Is everything all right?" Sarah asked. though her expression suggested she'd already picked up on the tension. Henley's smile became even more artificial when he saw Sarah and Maya. "Mrs. Washington, lovely to meet you. We were just explaining to your husband about some concerns the Homeowners Association has received. Nothing that can't be resolved, of course, but we do need to follow proper procedures." "What kind of procedures?" Sarah asked, shifting Maya to her other hip. Marcus noticed how both men's eyes lingered on his family, and something cold settled in his stomach. This wasn't about lawn care or landscaping violations. "Well, there's typically a fine structure for first-time violations," Henley explained, consulting his clipboard again. "In this case, we're looking at approximately $800 for the combined infractions. Of course, if the issues are addressed promptly, we might be able to reduce that amount." Marcus felt his jaw tighten. $800 was a significant sum, especially for violations that didn't actually exist. More concerning was the men's obvious discomfort with his family's presence and their focus on community standards and neighborhood character. He'd encountered this kind of coded language before, usually from people who had problems with families like his living in predominantly white neighborhoods. "I'd like to see the specific complaints in writing," Marcus said, his military bearing becoming more apparent.
"And I'll need to verify this with the HOA directly."
"Do you have business cards or contact information?" The two men exchanged a quick glance, and Marcus caught the micro-expression that passed between them. It was the look of people who hadn't expected to be questioned and weren't sure how to proceed. Henley recovered quickly, but not before Marcus had noted the hesitation. Of course," Henley said, patting his pockets in an exaggerated search. "I seem to have left my business cards in the truck." "Jeff, do you have any?" Morrison shook his head, maintaining his role as the silent partner. "That's all right," Marcus said smoothly. "I'll contact the HOA office directly. I have their number from our closing documents." This was a test, and he could see both men stiffen slightly at his words. "The thing is," Morrison said quickly, "we're actually a new enforcement division. The main office might not have all our information updated yet. That's why we're handling these issues directly with homeowners." Marcus nodded as if this explanation made perfect sense, while mentally filing away the obvious lie. Every legitimate HOA had clear procedures for violations, including written notices, appeal processes, and official documentation. These men were operating outside any normal system, which confirmed his growing suspicion that they weren't who they claimed to be. "Well, I appreciate you taking the time to stop by," Marcus said, beginning to close the door. "I'll look into these concerns and get back in touch with the appropriate people." "Wait," Henley said, his friendly mask slipping slightly. "The fines are due within 7 days. If they're not paid, the HOA has the authority to initiate legal proceedings for non-compliance." "I understand," Marcus replied. "I'm sure we can sort everything out through the proper channels." He closed the door firmly but politely, then immediately engaged both the deadbolt and chain lock. Sarah was staring at him with raised eyebrows. "That was weird," she said quietly, not wanting Maya to pick up on her concern. "Very weird," Marcus agreed, moving to the front window where he could observe the two men without being seen. They were walking slowly back to their white pickup truck, the same vehicle he'd noticed the evening before. Instead of leaving immediately, they sat in the truck for several minutes, apparently having an intense conversation. Marcus pulled out his phone and called the legitimate HOA office, which was closed for the weekend but had an automated message system. He left a detailed message describing the visit and requesting clarification about any alleged violations. He also took photos of the white truck and its license plate from his window, using the camera's zoom function to capture clear images of both the vehicle and its occupants. As he watched, the truck finally pulled away, but instead of leaving the neighborhood, it made a slow circuit around the block. Marcus counted the minutes, exactly 12 before the vehicle reappeared, driving past their house once more at the same deliberate pace he'd noticed the night before. Maya had returned to her coloring, blissfully unaware of the undercurrents of tension, but Sarah remained close to Marcus as they watched from their window. "Should I be worried?" she asked quietly. Marcus considered his response carefully. His instincts were telling him that this was the beginning of something more serious than a scam or attempted extortion. The men's focus on his family, Their obvious lies about HOA enforcement and their surveillance behavior all pointed to a more organized and potentially dangerous situation. "I think we need to be careful," he said finally. "And I'm going to make some calls on Monday to find out exactly what's going on." Monday morning brought confirmation of Marcus's worst suspicions. The real HOA office had no record of any violations against their property, no enforcement division beyond their regular management company, and definitely no employees named Robert Henley or Jeff Morrison. The customer service representative seemed genuinely confused by Marcus's description of the weekend visit, assuring him that all legitimate HOA communications came through written notices and official channels. Marcus sat in his home office, staring at the photos he'd taken of the white truck, trying to piece together what was really happening. The license plate had turned out to be fake. A quick search through his security consultant contacts revealed that the number belonged to a vehicle that had been scrapped 3 years earlier. These weren't opportunistic scammers or confused HOA volunteers. They were organized, prepared, and specifically targeting his family. The harassment escalated throughout the week in ways that were designed to look coincidental, but felt increasingly deliberate. On Tuesday, Marcus found a large pile of trash dumped at the end of their driveway, including food waste that attracted flies and created a smell that had their immediate neighbors shooting disapproving looks in their direction. Wednesday brought a dead possum placed prominently on their front lawn, positioned where Maya would see it when she came home from school. Sarah was the first to suggest that the incidents weren't random. "This feels personal," she said Thursday evening as they watched Marcus clean spray paint off their mailbox. The word "move" in block letters that hadn't been there when they'd left for work that morning. "Someone's trying to make us uncomfortable here." Marcus nodded grimly, his military instincts fully activated now. Someone was conducting psychological warfare against his family, using tactics designed to create fear and isolation while maintaining plausible deniability. Each incident was borderline, annoying and concerning, but not quite serious enough to warrant police involvement. The breakthrough came Friday afternoon when Marcus decided to take a personal day and conduct his own surveillance operation. He'd set up a small camera system earlier in the week, hidden devices that could monitor their property without being obvious to observers. More importantly, he'd started varying his own schedule and movement patterns, creating opportunities to observe his neighborhood from different angles. That's how he happened to be parked 3 blocks away when the white pickup truck returned at 2:30 p.m., followed by a second vehicle he hadn't seen before, a dark blue sedan with tinted windows. Marcus watched through binoculars as the 2 cars parked at the end of his street, close enough to observe his house but far enough away to avoid notice from casual observers. 4 men got out of the vehicles, including Henley and Morrison from the fake HOA visit. The other 2 were younger and looked more physically capable, wearing work clothes and baseball caps pulled low over their faces. Marcus photographed all of them, using a telephoto lens he'd borrowed from his consulting firm's equipment locker. The men split up with military-style precision. 2 took positions where they could watch both ends of the street, while Henley and one of the younger men walked directly toward Marcus's house. They moved with confidence as if they belonged in the neighborhood, but Marcus could see the practiced way they checked for witnesses and maintained communication through subtle hand signals. Marcus started his car and began following a predetermined route that would bring him home from a different direction, timing his arrival to coincide with whatever the men were planning. His years of tactical training had taught him the value of controlling when and where confrontations occurred, and he wasn't going to let these people operate against his family without consequences. He arrived at his street just as Henley was placing something in Marcus's mailbox while his partner kept watch. Marcus drove past without slowing, noting their positions and escape routes before parking around the corner and approaching on foot through his neighbor's backyard. His movement was silent and invisible, using landscape features and buildings to mask his approach. The object in the mailbox turned out to be a manila envelope containing photographs, pictures of Maya at her school, Sarah at the hospital where she worked, and Marcus himself entering his office building downtown. The message was clear. They were watching his family everywhere, and nowhere was safe from their attention. But Marcus had been watching them too, and now he had evidence of their surveillance and harassment campaign. More importantly, he had confirmed that these weren't random criminals or disgruntled neighbors. The level of organization, The surveillance photographs and the coordinated movement patterns suggested people with training and resources. Someone had hired professionals to intimidate his family. That evening, after Maya was asleep, Marcus showed Sarah the photographs and explained what he'd observed. Her face went through a range of emotions: fear, anger, and finally a determined calm that reminded him why he'd fallen in love with her strength. "So what do we do?" she asked, studying the images of their daughter walking to her classroom. "Call the police? Move, fight back?" Marcus had been asking himself the same questions all afternoon. The police would want more concrete evidence of actual crimes before taking action, and proving harassment required documentation that could take weeks to accumulate. Moving would feel like surrendering to whoever was behind this campaign, and might not even solve the problem if their motivation followed the family to a new location. "We document everything," he said finally. "We prepare for escalation, and we make it clear that intimidating a Delta Force veteran's family isn't the smart play they thought it was." Sarah nodded, understanding the implications. Marcus had killed people overseas who posed threats to American interests. The idea that someone thought they could terrorize his wife and daughter with impunity showed a fundamental misunderstanding of who they were dealing with. "How dangerous is this likely to get?" Sarah asked, her nurse's pragmatism cutting through emotional reactions to focus on practical concerns. Marcus considered the question carefully. The surveillance photo suggested planning and resources that went beyond casual racism or neighborhood disputes. Someone was investing significant time and money into driving them away, which meant the motivation was probably financial rather than purely personal. "I think it's going to get worse before it gets better," he admitted, but they're about to discover that they picked the wrong family to mess with. The next morning, Marcus began implementing security measures that would have seemed excessive a week earlier, but now felt absolutely necessary. He varied the family's routines, installed additional cameras and motion detectors, and started carrying his concealed weapon everywhere he went. Most importantly, he began applying the tactical principles he'd learned in special operations to the problem of protecting his family from an organized threat. His enemies had made their first mistake by revealing themselves too early. Now Marcus intended to use every skill he'd learned in military service to ensure they didn't get the chance to make another one. The escalation came the following Wednesday night just after midnight. Marcus was pulled from light sleep by the soft chime of his security system, motion detected in the backyard. Years of combat deployment had trained him to wake instantly and assess threats without the confusion that plagued most people roused from deep sleep. He slipped quietly from bed, leaving Sarah undisturbed, and moved to the window that provided the best view of their rear property. 3 figures dressed in dark clothing were moving systematically through his backyard, using the mature oak trees and landscaping for concealment. They moved with practiced stealth, avoiding the motion-activated lights he'd installed the week before, and staying in shadow patterns that suggested military or law enforcement training. These weren't random vandals or opportunistic burglars. They were professionals conducting a reconnaissance mission. Marcus had prepared for this possibility. His response was immediate and precise, drawing on protocols he'd used to protect forward operating bases in Afghanistan. He activated a silent alarm system that would record everything while alerting his emergency contacts, including several former military colleagues who lived within driving distance. Then he armed himself and began his own surveillance of the intruders. The men were thorough and systematic, examining his home's exterior for weak points while photographing windows, doors, and security features. One climbed onto their deck to test the sliding glass door that led into their kitchen, while another checked the basement windows for vulnerability. The third maintained overwatch, positioned where he could warn his partners if anyone approached. Marcus recognized their tactics because he'd used them himself during special operations missions. These men were planning something that required detailed knowledge of his home's layout and defenses. They weren't here to steal property or spray paint messages. They were conducting pre-operational intelligence gathering for something much more serious. Moving silently through his own house, Marcus positioned himself where he could observe all 3 intruders while maintaining multiple escape routes. His years of close-quarters combat training made him confident in his ability to handle 3 opponents if necessary, but he preferred to gather intelligence rather than initiate contact. Understanding their mission and capabilities would be more valuable than simply driving them away. The intruders spent nearly 30 minutes examining his property before withdrawing as carefully as they'd arrived. Marcus photographed their faces using night vision equipment, captured their vehicle information as they departed, and documented their methods and areas of focus. By the time they disappeared into the night, he had enough intelligence to understand that his family was facing a serious and organized threat. The photographs revealed faces he didn't recognize, but tactics he understood perfectly. These men had military or police training, access to professional equipment, and sufficient funding to conduct extended operations. Someone was paying significant money to gather detailed intelligence about his family's vulnerabilities, which suggested planning for kidnapping, home invasion, or worse. Marcus spent the rest of the night reviewing his security footage and cross-referencing the intruders' faces through databases available to his consulting firm. By morning, he'd identified 2 of them as former military contractors with backgrounds in overseas security work. The third remained unknown, but his equipment and methods suggested similar professional training. When Sarah woke up, Marcus showed her the overnight recordings without commentary, letting her draw her own conclusions about the seriousness of their situation. Her medical background had taught her to remain calm under pressure, but he could see the fear in her eyes as she watched strangers prowling around their home while their daughter slept upstairs. "We need to call the police," Sarah said quietly, still staring at the images on his laptop screen. "This is beyond harassment now. These people were preparing to break into our house." Marcus nodded, though he knew law enforcement would be limited in their response until an actual crime occurred. Trespassing and surveillance weren't federal offenses, and local police departments weren't equipped to handle what appeared to be a private military operation. Still, establishing an official record would be important if the situation escalated further. "I'm calling the police and the FBI," Marcus agreed, "but I'm also calling in some favors from people who understand what we're dealing with." Over the next 48 hours, Marcus assembled his own team of former special operations personnel who now worked in private security and consultation. These men understood threat assessment, personal protection, and the kind of asymmetric warfare being conducted against his family. More importantly, they were willing to provide the kind of help that law enforcement couldn't offer. The police had been professional but limited in their response, taking statements and promising increased patrols while explaining that no actual laws had been broken yet. The FBI field office had been more interested, particularly after seeing the surveillance photographs, but warned that federal investigation would take time to develop leads and identify the people behind the harassment campaign. Marcus's military contacts provided more immediate assistance. Within 24 hours, he had positive identification on all 3 intruders, background information on their employers, and preliminary intelligence about who might be funding their operations. The picture that emerged was both more complex and more dangerous than he'd initially suspected. The harassment campaign wasn't motivated by racism or neighborhood disputes, though those elements provided useful cover for the real objective. Someone wanted Marcus's family out of their house specifically, and that someone had significant resources and connections to hire professional operators for the job. The question was why their particular property was worth that kind of investment. The answer came from an unexpected source. His neighbor, Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who'd lived on their street for 30 years, and remembered when their neighborhood had been farmland. She knocked on their door Thursday evening, carrying a plate of homemade cookies and wearing an expression of determined concern. "I need to tell you something," Mrs. Chen said, once she was seated in their living room with Sarah and Marcus, "about your house and why some people don't want you here." Maya was at a sleepover with friends, which allowed the adults to speak freely about the threats her family was facing. Mrs. Chen had noticed the unusual activity around their house and pieced together enough of the situation to realize the Washington family was in danger. 20 years ago, a development company bought most of this neighborhood, Mrs. Chen explained. They planned to tear down all the houses and build luxury condominiums. But they needed every property to make the project work, every single house. Marcus felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. "What happened to that plan?" "The housing market crashed," Mrs. Chen continued. "The development company went bankrupt, but the land rights and development permits were sold to another corporation. I think someone is still trying to make that project happen, and your house is the one they need most." Sarah leaned forward in her chair. "Why our house specifically?" Mrs. Chen pulled out a manila folder she'd brought with her cookies. Because your lot sits at the corner where they planned the main entrance. Without your property, they can't access the rest of the development site. I kept all the newspaper articles from when they first proposed the project. Marcus studied the photocopied articles and planning documents Mrs. Chen had preserved. The original development would have displaced dozens of families and generated hundreds of millions in profits. If someone was still pursuing that objective, intimidating one family into selling would be a small price to pay for access to such massive returns. So they're trying to force us out so they can bulldoze our house, Marcus said, understanding the economic motivation behind the psychological warfare, which means this won't stop until we sell or until they're stopped permanently. Mrs. Chen nodded grimly. And if they're willing to hire the kind of men you've been dealing with, they're not going to give up easily. Marcus looked at his wife, seeing his own determination reflected in her expression. They'd built their life in this house in this neighborhood, and they weren't going to be driven away by corporate intimidation tactics, no matter how professional or well-funded. Then they're about to learn what happens when you threaten a family that knows how to fight back, Marcus said quietly. The confrontation Marcus had been anticipating came on a rainy Saturday morning in early October. Sarah had taken Maya to her sister's house for the weekend, giving Marcus the freedom to deal with whatever escalation his enemies were planning without risking his family's safety. He'd been monitoring multiple surveillance channels since dawn, tracking the positioning of vehicles and personnel around his neighborhood. At 10:15 a.m., 4 vehicles approached his street from different directions, converging in a pattern that indicated coordinated movement. Marcus recognized the white pickup truck and dark sedan from previous encounters, but the addition of a black SUV and panel van suggested this operation was significantly larger than anything they'd attempted before. From his concealed observation post in his attic, Marcus watched 12 men deploy around his property with military precision. They moved in coordinated teams, establishing overwatch positions and blocking escape routes while the primary assault team prepared to approach his front door. These weren't the same harassment specialists who'd been conducting surveillance. They were a professional extraction team equipped for serious violence. Marcus had spent the week preparing for exactly this scenario. His house had been transformed into a tactical defensive position, with reinforced entry points, concealed weapons caches, and multiple communication systems that would ensure law enforcement response, even if his primary systems were compromised. More importantly, he wasn't facing this threat alone. As the assault team reached his front porch, Marcus activated a signal that brought his own backup into play. 6 former Delta Force operators he'd served with in Afghanistan had been positioned around his neighborhood since before dawn, invisible to the corporate team but ready to respond when needed. The men threatening his family were about to discover they'd walked into a trap set by some of the most dangerous soldiers in American military history. The lead man rang Marcus's doorbell while his teammates took positions to breach the door if necessary. Marcus answered through his intercom system, his voice calm and controlled despite the adrenaline flowing through his system. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" he asked, though he could see exactly what they were planning through his security cameras. "Mr. Washington, we need to have a conversation," the team leader responded. He was a large man with the bearing of someone accustomed to intimidating people through physical presence. "Please open the door so we can discuss your situation." "I'm comfortable having this conversation through the intercom," Marcus replied. "Please state your business and identify who you're working for." The team leader's patience was clearly limited. "Sir, you have 60 seconds to open this door voluntarily. After that, we're coming in anyway, and the conversation becomes significantly less pleasant." Marcus smiled grimly as he watched the assault team prepare their entry tools. "I think you gentlemen have made a serious miscalculation about who you're dealing with." At his signal, his former teammates emerged from concealment around the corporate team's perimeter. 6 highly trained special operations veterans appeared simultaneously, each armed and positioned to control key members of the assault force. The corporate team found themselves outflanked and outgunned before they realized they were under observation. "Contact front," Marcus's teammate Jackson called out, using the military terminology that immediately identified him as a professional soldier. "All corporate personnel, weapons on the ground, hands where we can see them." The corporate team leader spun around, finally understanding that his carefully planned operation had become a disaster. Instead of intimidating an isolated family, they were facing a coordinated military response from people with superior training and tactical positioning. Marcus emerged from his house, armed but non-threatening, as his teammates maintained control over the corporate personnel. "Gentlemen, let me explain your situation," he said, addressing the 12 men who'd come to threaten his family. "You're currently surrounded by 6 Delta Force veterans who've spent the last decade killing people much more dangerous than you." The team leader tried to maintain his authority, despite the obvious shift in tactical advantage. "This is private property business. You don't understand the forces you're interfering with." "Actually, I understand them perfectly," Marcus replied, pulling out a folder of documents his investigation had uncovered. "Your employer is Meridian Development Corporation, which holds conditional development rights to this neighborhood pending acquisition of key properties. Your private military contractors hired to intimidate families into selling below market value." One of the younger corporate operatives looked nervous, clearly uncomfortable with how thoroughly their operation had been compromised. The team leader maintained his composure, but Marcus could see him calculating escape routes and tactical options. "The difference between you and me," Marcus continued, "is that I've spent my career serving my country, while you've spent yours terrorizing American families for corporate profits. My teammates and I took an oath to defend people like my wife and daughter from threats foreign and domestic." Jackson moved closer to the corporate team leader, his weapon ready but not yet aimed. "Sir, you and your people have about 30 seconds to decide how this ends. We can do this the easy way, where you walk away and never come back. Or we can do this the hard way, where we demonstrate why Delta Force operators are considered the most dangerous people on the planet." The team leader looked around at his men, seeing their tactical disadvantage and the professional competence of the soldiers surrounding them. Whatever his employer was paying for this operation, it wasn't worth engaging in combat with special operations veterans on their home ground. "This isn't over," the team leader said, signaling his men to withdraw. "Your family will never be safe as long as you stay here." Marcus stepped closer, letting his combat experience show in his posture and voice. "Actually, this is exactly where it ends, because if any of you come near my family again, you won't be dealing with harassment or intimidation tactics. You'll be dealing with a military response to terrorist threats against American civilians." As the corporate team retreated to their vehicles, Marcus's teammate Rodriguez activated a signal jammer that would prevent their communications for several minutes while they withdrew. Thompson and Williams followed the vehicles at a distance, ensuring they actually left the neighborhood rather than regrouping for another attempt. The remaining Delta Force veterans maintained overwatch until the corporate team was completely clear of the area. Only then did Marcus allow himself to relax slightly, though he knew the underlying threat hadn't been eliminated. "Brother, you know they'll be back," Jackson said as they watched the last corporate vehicle disappear around the corner. "Next time they'll bring more people and better planning." Marcus nodded, understanding that this confrontation had only bought him temporary breathing room. "Then we make sure there isn't a next time. It's time to take this fight to the people who hired them." His military training had taught him that defensive operations only worked temporarily against determined enemies. To protect his family permanently, he needed to eliminate the threat at its source. Meridian Development Corporation was about to discover that threatening a Delta Force veteran's family brought consequences they'd never considered. The war for his family's safety was far from over, but the balance of power had just shifted dramatically in Marcus's favor. Now it was time to go on the offensive. Marcus spent the next 2 weeks conducting the kind of intelligence operation he'd perfected during his military career. Except this time, the target was a corporate boardroom instead of a terrorist cell. Using resources from his security consulting firm and contacts throughout the defense contractor community, he methodically mapped Meridian Development Corporation's leadership structure, financial backing, and operational methods. What he discovered was a pattern of systematic intimidation, targeting minority families in gentrification zones across 3 states. Meridian specialized in acquiring properties through harassment campaigns that drove down market values, then flipping the land to luxury developers for massive profits. The company had refined their tactics over nearly a decade, using former military contractors to conduct psychological warfare against families who had no idea they were facing professional operators. The breakthrough came when Marcus's teammate Rodriguez, who worked in corporate cybersecurity, uncovered internal communications between Meridian executives discussing the Washington family specifically. The emails revealed not only the company's illegal harassment tactics, but also their frustration with Marcus's unexpected resistance to their intimidation campaign. "Listen to this," Rodriguez said, reading from his laptop during a meeting in Marcus's living room. From CEO Jonathan Blackwood to Operations Director Sandra Chen, the Washington situation has become a liability. The contractors we hired have failed twice now, and the target appears to have military training. Consider this our highest priority. We cannot allow one family to derail a $100 million development. Marcus studied the corporate organizational chart his team had assembled, identifying key decision-makers and their vulnerabilities. Blackwood was a former real estate attorney with connections throughout local government. Chen had a background in urban development and a reputation for ruthless efficiency. Both had built their careers on projects that displaced working-class families for profit. "They've made this personal," Jackson observed, pointing to another email that discussed eliminating the Washington problem permanently. "These people are talking about your family like a military objective." The final piece of Marcus's strategy came together when his investigation revealed that Meridian Development Corporation was publicly traded, with major investments from pension funds and university endowments. The company's stock price and reputation were vulnerable to public exposure of their illegal harassment campaigns, especially if that exposure came with evidence of organized intimidation against military veterans. Marcus had learned in special operations that the most effective attacks targeted an enemy's center of gravity, the source of their power and capability. For Meridian, that center of gravity was their public reputation and investor confidence. A corporate intimidation campaign against a decorated Delta Force veteran would destroy both. On a Monday morning in late October, Marcus initiated his counterattack across multiple fronts simultaneously. His team had prepared meticulously, ensuring maximum impact while maintaining legal boundaries that would protect them from retaliation. The first element was a federal complaint filed with the FBI's Domestic Terrorism Unit, supported by extensive documentation of Meridian's harassment campaign and the corporate emails Rodriguez had obtained. The second was a civil lawsuit filed in federal court, claiming violations of Marcus's civil rights under federal housing discrimination laws. The third was a coordinated media campaign that would make the Washington family's story a national news event. Marcus had contacted investigative journalists at major newspapers and television networks, providing them with exclusive access to his surveillance footage, corporate communications, and expert analysis of Meridian's tactics. The story had everything news organizations loved: a decorated military veteran, corporate corruption, and clear evidence of illegal intimidation campaigns. The media blitz began on Tuesday morning when the Washington Post published a front-page investigation titled "Corporate Harassment Campaign Targets Military Families." The article included Marcus's photographs of the fake HOA enforcers, surveillance footage of the midnight reconnaissance mission, and excerpts from the corporate emails discussing his family as a problem to be eliminated. By Wednesday, the story had gone viral on social media, with veterans organizations, civil rights groups, and housing advocates demanding congressional investigations into Meridian's practices. The company's stock price dropped 30% in 2 days as major investors distanced themselves from what one pension fund manager called un-American corporate terrorism. Jonathan Blackwood tried to control the damage through a carefully crafted public relations response, claiming the harassment campaign was conducted by rogue contractors acting without corporate authorization. But Marcus's investigation had prepared for this defense, providing journalists with evidence that the intimidation tactics were standard corporate policy approved at the highest levels. The turning point came Thursday afternoon when Meridian's board of directors held an emergency meeting and announced Blackwood's immediate resignation. Sandra Chen was terminated the same day, along with 3 other executives implicated in the harassment campaigns. The company's new leadership issued a public apology to the Washington family and announced the immediate suspension of all development projects pending a complete review of company practices. Friday morning brought the news Marcus had been waiting for: federal indictments against 12 individuals involved in the harassment campaign, including the corporate team that had attempted to assault his home. The charges included conspiracy, violation of civil rights, and domestic terrorism, with potential sentences that would keep the perpetrators in federal prison for decades. But the most satisfying moment came Saturday afternoon when Marcus received a personal phone call from Meridian's new CEO, offering to purchase his property at significantly above market value, not as intimidation, but as genuine compensation for the trauma his family had endured. "Mr. Washington," the CEO said, "I want to personally apologize for what my predecessor's administration put your family through. Meridian Development Corporation is committed to making this right, and we're prepared to offer you fair market value plus substantial additional compensation for your suffering." Marcus listened to the offer politely before delivering his response. "Sir, I appreciate your apology and your company's change in leadership. However, my family isn't moving. We built our life in this house, in this neighborhood, and we're staying right here." The silence on the other end of the call stretched for several seconds before the CEO responded. "I understand completely, Mr. Washington. The development project has been permanently canceled. Your neighborhood will remain exactly as it is." That evening, Marcus stood on his front porch watching Maya chase fireflies in their backyard. Just as he had on that peaceful night in summer when this whole ordeal began, Sarah joined him, slipping her hand into his as they observed their daughter's joyful pursuit of the glowing insects. "So it's really over?" Sarah asked, though she could see the answer in her husband's relaxed posture and genuine smile. "It's over," Marcus confirmed. "The corporate executives are facing federal charges, their company is under investigation, and their development project is dead. Most importantly, Maya can grow up in the house her parents chose for her, in a neighborhood where she's safe." As they watched their daughter's delighted laughter echo across their yard, Marcus reflected on the lessons his military training had taught him about protecting what mattered most. Sometimes the greatest victories weren't won on foreign battlefields, but in suburban neighborhoods, where families had the right to live without fear. The men who had threatened his family had learned that targeting a Delta Force veteran brought consequences they'd never imagined. But more importantly, they'd learned that some things, home, family, and the right to live in peace, were worth fighting for with everything a soldier had to give. Mrs. Chen appeared at her fence, waving cheerfully as she watched Maya's firefly expedition. Other neighbors emerged from their houses, creating the kind of community evening that Marcus had envisioned when they'd first moved to Maple Grove Estates. This was what he'd fought overseas to protect: American families living safely in their own neighborhoods, free from the kind of fear his family had faced. As the last light faded from the sky and Maya reluctantly agreed to come inside, Marcus took one final look around their quiet street. Everything appeared perfectly normal, exactly as it should be in a safe suburban neighborhood where children could chase fireflies without fear and veterans could protect their families using the skills they'd learned serving their country. The Washington family was home and they were staying.